Hello, and welcome to Glasgow, where we're in the Mitchell Library to talk about a much talked of novel, Day by A.L.Kennedy, winner of the Costa Prize in 2007, and a book that takes us back to the days after World War II, when those jerky black and white films began to tell the stories of daring do across Europe. This story is set in 1949, though the way that its layers of time operate is one of its complications and the mechanism, really, that gives it much of its spirit. And the central character, it's for you to decide if he's a hero or an anti-hero, is Alfred Day. We meet him on a film set in Germany where he's reliving his war in the RAF, and in the course of the book, his life is laid bare before us, complete with failures, moments of brief exuberance, and one very big secret. The book's success clearly had a lot to do with A.L.Kennedy's narrative style, which does make demands on the reader, but compels you to read on. A.L. Kennedy, welcome to Book Club.
Thank you for having me.
When you got the idea for the book and began to write it, was the style, the way you use time, the way you use, I suppose, what we call a stream of consciousness, in your head, or was that just the way it began to unfold on the page?
I try and be as organic as possible, which is a horrible word to use, but I think because I started off being a drama student, I tend to go from personality. The way that Alfred was and the complexity of the story that I ended up wanting to tell, it became necessary to make the narrative the way it was. But I didn't make a technical decision to do X, Y, or Z because I just don't think that way apart from anything else. I wouldn't have understood what I meant.
It has to feel natural.
Yeah, I kind of go on gut instinct as much as possible and just go with it. And I think for a very long time, for 2 or 3 years, about a novel before I write it. So I just allow it to happen in the back of my head for as long as possible. Then it will have some kind of life of its own by the time I actually start writing it.
Well, it takes us straight to our first question.
I didn't find the start of the novel easy to follow, with the story jumping about in time and place, but I persevered and I really enjoyed the story. I got a lot out of it. But I know of other people who have given up at that point. Does it concern you? Do you lose sleep at night thinking people aren't reading through my novel? Or do you think that reading a novel is something that requires hard work in order to get something good out of it?
Oh, I hope not. I did a reading in Sweden, in Stockholm, and a woman came up at the end when you're doing the signing, and we'd done stand-up and we'd had a very nice evening and thought that's a successful performance, and I was flushed with pride doing the signing thing, and this woman came up and said, "Can you put something encouraging on the book?" I thought she meant, "I'm going through a bad time and I've chosen you as a guru because your words have uplifted me so much." And I said, "Oh, is there something bad happening that please don't tell me about in detail?" And she said, no, I've tried to read it 3 times and I just can't get through it. Can you help me in some way? No, it's not actually my aim. I just knew that I was going to have to take you to a mental place where I would hope you wouldn't normally go. And in order to do that, I had to kind of shake you at the beginning to make you give up, and then push you to the point where you could be with Alfred on the plane at the end and it would be a realistic experience. And basically I knew that some people would go with that and some people wouldn't.
Some listeners will be tuning in not having read the book. Give us a brief account of how this time business works, because it's very, very striking. I mean, it's the way the book operates, and particularly at the beginning, it's quite arresting.
I kind of made the structure of the book to conform to Alfred's psychology. He's in 1949, he's in a film that's a war film, playing sort of somebody like himself, and I basically make it go back in time whenever his head goes back in time.
And we discover this fact, of course, gradually.
Yeah, because I wanted to play with the point in time where a war becomes films about the war and a reality becomes stories. So I wanted you to be slightly confused, which is never a good idea, but I wanted you to not know whether the war was still going or wasn't still going, and I wanted you to be unsure, because I think we quite often are unknowingly unsure.
I think we were unsure.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. The trouble is, as a reader, I like writers who pick me up by the ears, shake me, slap me around, throw me about, and just that I'm overwhelmed by the prose. And I know that's not an experience that everybody likes, but I'm trying to give the reader the experience that I would most like. Clearly, it's not for everyone.
There's a question here.
Where did the inspiration for Alfred F.D. come from?
For the man himself?
Yes,
I like reading old magazines, and I read a magazine article about the filming of The Wooden Horse, if you know that film. And this happened with a lot of films in that period. People who had been POWs, British POWs, were playing extras in the film. And part of the book was answering the question, why would you go back to somewhere which was not necessarily the most pleasant place you'd been in your life? And why would you relive that? Obviously, the book only answers that question for Alfred. And weirdly, a lot of the rest of him arrived just because his name arrived. I woke up one morning and I knew what he was called, and that very quickly defined him a lot.
He started to take on flesh and blood from that point.
I think, and I knew he was a gunner, that suggested a type of personality to me, that particular type of approach to warfare, because he specifically picked it.
You're a fairly prominent critic of more or less every war I've ever heard of, but what is it about that period and the way that it's recollected that interests you and moves you?
I was interested in the idea of a citizen army, which is a very different army to one where you have professional soldiers. It's as close to a kind of righteous war as we've had for a very long time. And it was very well remembered within my family, because really almost none of my family took part in the services. They were kind of saying this on the BBC. They were sort of to do with the black market more than anything else. So for them, the war was, on the one hand, awful because they were in the industrial area around Coventry, Birmingham, so they were getting bombed a lot. And on the other hand, they were sort of having a great time because it's such a permissive environment. I just was fascinated by that, and I was fascinated with the possibility of being in a male environment, which of course you can't enter if you're female because it becomes not a male environment.
He seemed an all-time loser, Day, and yet you made him a rear gunner, which was the all-time loser's job in the RAF.
Yeah.
They didn't last very long, yet he survived to 29 operations, which in my book made him the all-time winner. Is that how you see him?
It's kind of both. My grandfather oddly wanted to be a tail gunner for that very reason. The only person more likely to die was a U-boat. So yeah, I just wondered what kind of a guy would go for that. And yeah, you know, he's a little man with a horrible childhood, the kind of person who quite often is attracted to the services because it becomes a family that he hasn't had.
I wanted to go back to how you kind of recreated how the men were feeling inside the bomber, and I wondered about your sort of research methods, because you really do take you in there and you can feel the tension of the moment and the exhilaration that they have as well with their successful outings. And I just wondered, you know, had you managed to speak to any people that had actually lived through any of that experience?
I specifically didn't speak to veterans because I didn't want to say, please relive potentially the worst times of your life and I will then go away, never see you again and make money out of them. That seemed to be morally reprehensible. I did a huge amount of reading. I went to air bases, looked at aeroplanes, taxied on a working Lancaster, sat in the turret, went to the Imperial War Museum, held a Browning 303 machine gun, breathed on it to make it hot so it would smell like a handled ammunition, looked at the training manuals, looked at the training films, looked at the clothes. And after 3 years of that and listening to the music and listening to the radio broadcasts, a certain part of your head has gone to a different time, and actually it becomes quite difficult to come back. You realise that time travel actually messes you up in the head slightly because you begin to get emotional associations that aren't true.
One of the interesting things about the book is the way that there is a strand of loneliness, anger, frustration in Day, but there's also the realisation that he's lived in a world where camaraderie and membership of a gang, as it were, in the back of the plane and then on the film set is important. Now we can hear a passage from the book, I think, where that is sort of illustrated towards the end. Can you set the scene for us and just read the passage?
This is from almost the end of the book. There's a fake concert as part of the film, which is the usual thing of men dressing up as women and people digging with spoons elsewhere. And this is the real concert where the people kind of say, this is not for film, this is us saying goodbye again and kind of tying it up more neatly. So he's decided to sing a song that he used to sing when he got down off the plane with Pluckrose. He stands towards the front of the little stage and he waits and he smiles at them. The rows of men he doesn't much know and will very soon not meet again. Can't do me a single bit of harm. And he breathes in as deep and he shuts his eyes and he starts to sing, just the way he did back at his school in the assembly hall. He gives them Jerusalem, sweet and straight as he can make it. For a line or two there seems a numb space ahead of him, and then a few voices join him in the music as it stretches on, forward and up. In the ache it raises out and doesn't fill, only rolls out further. As the verse widens, strengthens, more and more singers go along with it. Alfred standing, and the sound like a love in him now and round him, tilting his head and wrapping him with a light he only touches, cannot see. And he can believe that he hears Pluckrose singing, that lovely, awful voice, and they are here together again, and yelling the England that will never be. And he can believe that he hears the Bastard, and Malloy, and Torrington, and Miles, and Parks, and they are back and didn't die. And he can believe that he hears his skipper. And he can believe that if he opens up his eyes, the benches will be full of all the boys lost to the sky, and his friends the closest, his crew the closest, so near that he can take their hands and know they are well, and never were harmed, and never were frightened, never lost. And he can believe that he is forgiven. He can believe so much, the truth of it makes him weep.
One of the good points about the book, I thought, was the way you captured the way men speak to each other. And it's not a kind of one-note conversation. We don't all just talk about football. So at various times, it's barbed, it's confrontational, there's warmth, there's a bit of hope, there's humour, there's kind of gallows humour in there as well. How easily did that come to you as a female author? And also, I'd like to ask about your use of the dialect as well. Mm-hmm. Was that something you had to work on in draft form?
The guys speaking to guys, I love the impossibility of writing. And as a heterosexual woman, you spend so much of your time trying to work out how guys work. It's fantastic.
Why?
Research. Just because you're inexplicable creatures. You're lovely and fascinating, but you're much more difficult than we are.
Whereas women are open books, I know.
Absolutely. Yeah. Straight down the line. You never want to fence women. They're all dirty fighters. Men are much easier. I think it's easier for women to, at a certain sense, if you take society's values, it's easier for us to write up into a male character than for a male character to write down in the perception of society. It just is more complicated. The dialect thing is that the Black Country Staffordshire dialect, always very, very fond of, and it's the one that my grandparents had.
I was going to ask where that came from, because, you know, that's not where we assume you come from.
No, Staffordshire accent is lovely, and I can't do it. I would have to be around people who still had it, and it is really the...
But it touches your ear, clearly.
Oh, and it's beautiful. Things like chimney being chimbly. If you're stupid, you're a wazzock. I can hear my grandmother, who's very spiky, slightly crazy lady. It's a beautiful dialect. It's a dialect of people who love words, and little individual towns very close to each other would have different words for different things. Again, he arrived and he was going to be from there. I wanted him to have had to have changed his voice to be in the RAF and to go back there when he kind of broke down.
I was quite interested about you talking how you set it in a film of prisoner of war, because my view of the 40s and 50s English films is they're all very much classed on the officer class. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I look back to The Wooden Horse and anything like it, everybody's terribly awfully, you know. And maybe there's a chap around there who might be Batman or something, you know. But why did you decide to make Alfred working class?
Obviously the films are partly set in those camps because the officers didn't have to work, and if it had been a non-officer camp, they had to go out and do a job, and it was less easy for them to escape because they couldn't be tunnelling all day because they were doing something else all day. And that there was a slight separation. The back of the airplane did tend to be slightly more scruffy than the front a bit, and the wireless operator gunner or gunner generally might be working class. And it was definitely going to be expended probably. But yeah, I wanted him to be a little guy who was always on the back foot. He arrived as being very angry, and I didn't know why he was very angry initially. This just sounds as if I'm bonkers, but you know, it's like a very short man who would stand very close to people who annoyed him and kind of have his chin in the chest of the bloke that he was maybe going to punch, but not punch. And it was just finding out why he was that way and why he was so secretive about why he was that way was kind of, again, part of the journey of the book.
Halfway through the book, I began to think it was partly a love story. Mm-hmm. I thought he came across as a man who was capable of very deep love, his love for his mother, his love for Pluck Rose, and his love for Joyce. But the one love that was lacking to me was his love for himself.
Yeah, yeah.
But eventually, when he accepted himself, I felt that meant he could go on with Joyce. Was that right? Is that right in that?
I think, yes. I mean, he's obviously not, he's a man of his time, and he's not analytical in a sort of modern psychological way, but I think he kind of knows the right thing to do is to go back to the camp, have it do whatever it's going to do to him, and then he'll either go home and shoot himself, or he'll go home and try Joyce again, which, whether you think falling in love or being shot in the head, which is the most dangerous, I think he goes for the riskier one myself. He's a very passionate person. I mean, everybody has a capacity for love and passion, but you don't normally see it.
You're listening to Book Club on BBC Radio 4. We're in the Mitchell Library in Glasgow. A.L. Kennedy is talking about her novel, Day. And we're talking about Alfred Day. Did you like him?
I was a bit curious about the violence of the man. You had him, you came across as very sympathetic. He was very careful of people, particularly people who were weaker than he was. But he was extremely violent, and often at times when he was not terribly provoked. I mean, sometimes he was provoked, but sometimes he wasn't. But I was interested that you seemed to draw that violence not from the war, which a lot of people would assume that was where he was getting it from, but from his childhood. And I was just wondering how you felt, whether or not there had been a war. I suspect he would have been a very violent man, and that made him a very interesting kind of character.
In just kind of doing it the way that I do it, which is to fire questions at somebody as if they existed, and eventually they appear to. The answer to why he was angry and why he was violent seemed to be deeper than an experience that would be as late as the war, albeit that sort of 1718-19. He just was furious. He just was somebody who, if somebody looked at him wrong, it would be unprovoked, but it would be an echo from something that the strangers would not know about. And that seemed to be a clear part of himself. And I found it interesting to, partly it is a sort of crime story, but most of the people who commit crimes get away with it. In fact, almost all the people who commit crimes within the book are not brought to book, which I think is realistic quite often.
And it brings us to a very important element in the book. The crime to which you allude is one that he committed. And it's dropped in to the reader in a very delicate, almost offhand way, very early on in the book, where the word murder is mentioned, and you can miss it. And it's there, and then you suddenly begin to realise its significance. And of course he's committed one of the most appalling things that anybody could do.
Indeed. Well, I wanted to try and again look at war from lots of different angles, and one of them would be within the context where he was operating. Murdering somebody during those years was tiny, and plus his job was to murder people, but that murdering was okay. So just to look at that whole area of who you're allowed to kill, who you're not allowed to kill, whether you get away with these things, why you get away with them.
Well, let's be clear about what he did.
He kills his father. He believes, and I think he is correct, that his father has killed his mother. Certainly his father's a horrible, violent, nasty, drunk man. And he decides, particularly with the military training, and it's not that uncommon for people who are the sons of violent fathers to start boxing or to do things that are about becoming strong when they become men. And he comes back and thinks, right, I will do what I have to stop him being alive anymore.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to talking about getting into Alfred Day's head. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if there was any sort of psychological fallout from that for yourself in terms of the way that you were viewing human nature after this.
There's kind of a line you sort of devote. It is like sitting down acting to a certain degree. You're just giving over a tiny bit of your head to willingly go as far as you can go into a constructed place. I don't think many writers would be confused about who they are, just as most actors don't get troubled by that. It's just a place that you get used to donating to somebody. I have found that because I spent so long doing the research, and because you get so far into it, I can't be on a plane now because I expect to have a 50% chance of dying, which has become very expensive. To go to Stockholm, it takes 2 days instead of 2 hours. But it's nice and ecological.
And I suppose the clue to the way you deal with it is the fact that you do stand-up comedy as well. you can handle both these things. You can get inside the head of somebody like Alfred Day. Indeed, you can invent his head. Let's be clear what you did.
Yep.
But at the same time, you can walk onto a platform and try to make people laugh, albeit with various shafts of blackness in the midst of it.
Well, most things that are funny are about sex and death and being helpless in the face of awfulness. I mean, that's all the things that you laugh at, really. It's a good advert for the comedy. But part of it is just that it's immediate. The whole thing about writing a novel is it's 3 years of research, a year and a half of writing. You get no response until you no longer care. It's going to be a year later. And if you're standing there with folk, if you tell a joke, they laugh. It's immediate. It's more than immediate. The way they look at you is immediate. And it reminds you that what you're doing is telling stories to people, even if they're absent. And you can really forget that, particularly after you've been writing for a long time. You can disappear up your own passageways sometimes.
Just talking about humour, I thought there were splashes of humour through the book, and we've spoken about Pluckrose, who I think brought a lot of that, and I was very fond of him as a character.
I like it.
I was wanting to ask, was that a conscious decision, a deliberate decision to bring a Pluckrose type character to lighten it, because it can be quite bleak?
Give us your own character sketch of Pluckrose, because he is a terribly important part of the book.
Pluckrose, he just
Wonderful
talks.
name, apart from anything else.
It's a true name as well. Pluckrose is, he talks. He's like a Mercutio character. He just, very brave, but he does that undercutting and self-effacing and self-deprecating thing. And he's a very loving person. He's one of those fish out of water that can end up in the services.
It's interesting you make a reference, a Shakespearean reference there. I mean, Pluckrose is a wonderfully kind of old-fashioned, literary, almost concocted name, and yet it takes us back to some of those, I don't know, sort of characters who seem to be created for particular purposes in, fiction or drama, and none the worse for that.
And you have to bear in mind that I was infected by Shakespeare at an early age, so that's kind of ruined me forever.
And the disease is chronic?
It is. It's incurable. And it gets worse. I wish people said splud. People say struth, which is a contraction of God's truth, and splud is God's blood, but that one didn't survive. People should you people and the people at home, start saying splud. It's a really good way of swearing. It's lovely. Much better than struth. Where was I? If you know your book's going to be unremittingly bleak, and I've got a reputation for just making you want to hang yourself anyway, I know that there has to be humour there. And the RAF sense of humour was very sophisticated, very dark, and always there, because otherwise you wouldn't survive. So there's a lot of specifically RAF humour, and it was hard-hitting stuff.
Because they were dying in vast numbers.
Yeah, and if you jumped out of a plane on your parachute candle and you mashed yourself up on the ground, that was jumping to a conclusion, which is one way of dealing with it.
You've just told us fairly frankly that you regard your work as being bleak.
Well, I don't, but I know everybody else does.
I see. What I'd like to know is, what is it? At what point do you think Alfred Day turns his life around? Is it the Jerusalem rendition at the concert? Mm-hmm. Is it Joyce that rescues him? What is it that turns his life from being bleak to being, at least I thought at the end, quite positive? There's a positive ending for him.
I think he is a very brave man in that he is afraid a lot of the time, and he was afraid for the whole of his childhood. But I think there's one thing that he has been in flight from, which is actually saying, I will attempt to love and be loved. For me, it sort of happens on the plane flying back. There's something about that says it's over, and that he can go, if he goes quickly, and if he doesn't go home, he doesn't go back to Ivor, he just goes to where she lives and doesn't stop himself and says, I need you, I need this, I'm putting myself in your hands, I'm asking you to do what only you can do, to be the person that only you can let me be. It's his last act of courageousness, really.
And you make the point, in the course of that of course brave people sometimes do bad things.
Yes, brave people sometimes do bad things, sometimes do bad things for good reasons, sometimes do bad things because it's the best they can do under the circumstances. Life is morally complicated.
Have you had much feedback from people in the RAF with regard to your book?
I wondered that too.
I know. I have had. It's been really moving. Veterans, when I was reading the work in progress, turned up, particularly a gentleman called Geoffrey Payne, who was from Staffordshire and was a tail gunner and was in Lancasters. No, it's been very... On the one hand, it's nice that people have really 100% of the time said it's correct. On the other hand, if somebody phones you up and says, that's absolutely how I feel, I don't want anybody to feel the way Alfred feels, because I've kind of been in Alfred's head as far as I could be, and it's a horrible way to feel. And after 60 years, you see it in the guy's eyes because they've heard the reading and it's put them back there, that they're still in pain. And that reality of war you don't see because it just echoes and it's under the surface, and that people are just still bleeding. And the really moving thing was to read from the book in Germany, to read from the book in Hamburg, and it's about the firebombing, the first firestorm bombing in Hamburg, and to get such a welcome and such an outpouring of grief, but just the whole grief of, everybody went really wrong. We really took a wrong turn, and everybody ended up hurt. That was very interesting. Actually, the post-book experience, it's almost more moving. I really didn't expect it. You end up being on the verge of tears and hugging people at the end of most readings. It became kind of exhausting. I mean, lovely, but really tiring.
A.L.Kennedy, thank you very much indeed for being our guest on Book Club and talking with us about Day.